3 days after I gave birth to my daughter, my mother-in-law walked into my hospital room carrying a Louis Vuitton tote and a manila envelope. She didn't knock. My husband was standing by the window, his back to me. He'd been like that for most of the morning, standing, staring, hands in his pockets like he was waiting for something. I'd assumed he was just tired. We'd both been up all night. The baby had colic, and the nurses kept rotating in and out, and honestly, I was so exhausted I could barely lift my arms. But when my mother-in-law walked in and my husband didn't turn around, I understood. He wasn't tired. He was waiting. She set the tote on the chair beside my bed, the chair where he should have been sitting. And she looked at me the way you look at a contractor who did mediocre work on your kitchen, polite, evaluating, already calculating what it would cost to fix. "You look terrible," she said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. "I gave birth yesterday," I said. She opened the envelope. I want to be clear about something. I had never been naive about who my mother-in-law was. I knew from the first dinner she invited me to, the one where she'd seated me at the far end of the table and spent 45 minutes talking about a girl my husband had dated in college, that she was someone who communicated primarily through dominance. Everything was a negotiation, everything had a price. She just preferred that you not notice the transaction until she was already done with you. What I had been naive about was my husband. The envelope contained two things: a set of legal documents and a cashier's check. I looked at the number on the check. I looked at it for a long time. $18 million, my mother-in-law said, is more than generous. The lawyers have already reviewed the agreement. You'd be relinquishing parental rights, obviously. But you'd be comfortable. You could start over. New city, new life. I looked at my husband. He still hadn't turned around. "She just had a baby," I said. "Your granddaughter." "My son's daughter," she said. "Which is precisely the point." She explained it clearly, the way you explain something to someone you think won't understand it the first time. The family trust, her late husband's estate, set up in 1987, had a clause. Any child of my husband's had to be raised within the family, under her roof. With the nannies she approved, the schools she selected, the values she determined were appropriate. If I was in the picture, that wouldn't be possible. I had, as she put it, a different orientation. I asked her what that meant. She smiled. "You work, darling. You have a career. You have opinions. You'd want input. She's my daughter." "For now," she said, and slid the check closer to me. I was 31 years old. I had given birth less than 36 hours earlier. I had 14 stitches and an IV in my left arm, and I hadn't slept properly in 2 days, and the woman standing in front of me was offering me $18 million to walk away from my newborn child. And my husband still hadn't turned around. I need to go back a little, because none of this happened in a vacuum. I met my husband 6 years ago at a fundraiser for a children's hospital in Chicago. He was charming in that effortless, slightly detached way that very handsome men sometimes are. Like he knew he didn't have to try, but tried anyway just for sport. He was working at his family's real estate development firm. I was 3 years into my job as a labor and employment attorney at a mid-size firm downtown. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged. We got married. His mother had opinions about the wedding. She had opinions about everything. She had opinions about everything. But for the first few years, I told myself this was just how wealthy families worked. Everything was managed, curated, organized around the preservation of the family brand. I'd grown up in a normal house in Columbus, Ohio, with parents who argued about grocery store brand versus name brand and took road trips in a minivan. I figured I just didn't understand the rules yet. What I understand now is that I understood them perfectly. I just didn't want to. About 2 years into our marriage, I started noticing things. My husband took calls at odd hours and stepped outside. He had a work phone and a personal phone, and occasionally a third phone I didn't recognize. When I asked, he said it was for a development project. I believed him because I wanted to. Because it was easier. Because I was working 60-hour weeks and I was tired, and we had a good life, a nice apartment, dinner parties, a shared social calendar. When I got pregnant, everything shifted. My mother-in-law called me the day I told my husband, not to congratulate me, to ask whether I had read the prenuptial agreement recently. I had, actually. I was a lawyer. I'd read it 3 times before I signed it, and I knew exactly what it said and what it didn't. But the fact that she called that same day told me everything I needed to know about what she'd been told and how quickly. The pregnancy was hard. I developed preeclampsia at 32 weeks and was on modified bed rest for the last month. My husband was attentive in a performative way. He brought me things, he showed up to appointments, he said the right words. But there was a distance in him that I couldn't close. I kept telling myself it was stress. The firm was in the middle of a major acquisition. His mother was pressuring him about a property deal in Miami. We were fine. The night I went into labor, he drove me to the hospital. He held my hand. He was present. And then our daughter was born and he held her for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock, the way you do when you're terrified. And then he set her down and stood up and walked to the window. He never really came back from that window. So there I was, hospital bed, IV, 14 stitches, my mother-in-law with her Louis Vuitton tote and her $18 million check. I need you to leave, I said. I understand this is emotional, this is my room. You came here without being invited, and you brought legal documents to my hospital bed the day after I gave birth. I need you to leave right now. She looked at my husband. Some signal passed between them. We'll give you time to think, she said. She picked up the envelope and set it on the bedside table. The offer has a window, don't wait too long. She left. My husband finally turned around. He looked exhausted, genuinely deeply tired in a way that made him look older than he was. For a second I felt sorry for him, which tells you something about how far gone I was. I'm sorry, he said. Who is she? I said. Not a question. I already knew there was a she. I just needed him to say it. He told me her name. He told me they'd been seeing each other for 14 months. He told me she was pregnant, 8 weeks, and that his mother had decided this was the moment to consolidate things. He said that phrase, consolidate things, like we were talking about a business merger. Our daughter is in the nursery down the hall, I said. I know. You've been standing at that window for 6 hours. I know. Get out of my room. He got out. I want to tell you that I cried. I probably did at some point when no one was looking. But what I remember from those next few hours isn't grief. It's something colder and more focused, which looking back makes sense, because I am, professionally, someone who thinks about leverage for a living. I called my sister. She was on a plane from Portland by that evening. I called my firm's senior partner, who is also one of my closest friends, and I told her the broad strokes. She didn't say much. She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need to know everything about that trust." Here's something I've learned in 10 years of practicing employment and labor law. People who use legal documents as weapons almost always believe the person on the other side won't read them. Not really. They'll be intimidated. They'll be overwhelmed. They'll see the official language and the notary stamps and the large number at the top, and they'll think, this is too big for me. This is beyond me. I should probably just sign it. My mother-in-law had been operating this way for decades. It had always worked. She married into money, and then when her husband died, she turned managing that money into a full-time occupation. She knew the trust inside and out. She'd amended it twice. She had a team of attorneys who specialized in estate planning and family law. What she did not have was a daughter-in-law who had spent the last 4 years doing pro bono work for a nonprofit that helped low-income workers fight illegal employment contracts. I read the trust documents she'd left on my bedside table, and then I called the number for the law firm on the letterhead and requested the full original filing from 1987. They stalled, which was fine. I had other sources. My father-in-law had a business partner, a man named Mr. Partner Tremblay, who had been quietly estranged from the family for 11 years following a dispute over a commercial property in Lincoln Park. I had met him exactly once at a funeral, and he had pressed his card into my hand and said, "If you ever want to understand your husband's family, call me." I had filed that card away in a place I didn't think I'd need. I called Mr. Tremblay. He was delighted to hear from me. What he told me over the next 3 hours, and later confirmed in writing with documentation, was this: The trust my father-in-law had established in 1987 had been amended not twice, as my mother-in-law's attorneys had told my husband, but 4 times. The Fourth Amendment, made 8 months before my father-in-law died, was the one no one talked about. It stipulated that in the event of any legal action, fraud, or coercion involving the disbursement of trust funds, including specifically payments made to induce a family member to surrender legal rights, the entire trust would revert to a charitable foundation of the testator's choosing. My father-in-law had, apparently, known his wife fairly well. The clause had never been triggered because no one had ever known about it. The attorneys my mother-in-law used had been replaced after the Fourth Amendment was filed. The original filing was in a county records archive in suburban Cook County. It had never been digitized. Mr. Tremblay had a copy. My sister arrived at the hospital at 9 that evening with an overnight bag and a container of soup from the Vietnamese place near my apartment. She sat in the chair next to my bed, the right chair, the one that faced me. And she didn't say anything for a while. She just looked at the baby. "She looks like Mom," my sister said finally. "I know. What are you going to do?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you sure?" I said, "They came to my hospital room the day after I had a baby." She nodded. "Okay. What do you need me to do?" I was discharged on a Thursday. My husband had vacated the apartment. His clothes were gone, a few of his things. He'd left a note that said he was staying at his mother's house and that he hoped we could handle things civilly. I kept the note. I didn't respond. I had 2 weeks of maternity leave before I was due back at the firm, but I'd been doing most of the work from my phone and laptop within 5 days. My mother's old friend from Columbus, a retired woman named Frances who'd been looking for something to do, moved into the guest room to help with the baby at night. My sister stayed for 10 days. My senior partner cleared my calendar of everything except one file. The one file was my mother-in-law. The thing about bringing a fraud and coercion claim against a trust of that size is that you need everything to be clean and documented and airtight before you file anything, because once you file, you can't unfile. The other side will move fast, and they will move hard, and if there are any gaps, they'll find them. I didn't have gaps. What I had, the Fourth Amendment from the county archive. Mr. Tremblay's written account with documentation of the original trust terms, photographs, which my sister had thought to take, bless her, of the cashier's check, and the legal documents my mother-in-law had left at my bedside. Time-stamped hospital records showing I had given birth 22 hours before she arrived. A record of the call she'd made to my husband the day I announced my pregnancy. And a very interesting set of wire transfer records showing that $18 million had moved from a trust account to a holding account 4 days before my daughter was born. They had been planning this for months. The morning my attorney filed the claim, I sent my mother-in-law a letter. Not from my lawyer. From me. I want to be clear, it was not a dramatic letter. There were no speeches in it. I didn't say things like "you underestimated me," or "you'll regret this." I just told her in plain language what had been filed, what the Fourth Amendment stipulated, and what the likely outcome would be. I told her she had 72 hours to respond through counsel. I found out later she read it 3 times. The next 6 months were not easy. I won't pretend they were. My husband contested nothing. He had retained his own attorney by then, separate from his mother, which told me everything about the state of his relationship with her. He and I negotiated a custody agreement that gave me primary custody with scheduled visitation. He paid child support. He showed up to the visits at first sporadically and then more consistently. I don't know what he felt or feels. That's not my story to tell. His mother fought the trust claim for 4 months. Her attorneys were good. Mine were better, and I was also one of mine, which gave us an advantage in terms of both cost and strategy. The Fourth Amendment held. The charitable reversion clause was triggered. The $18 million that had been moved into the holding account was redirected, along with a significant additional portion of the trust, to the foundation my father-in-law had named, a non-profit providing legal aid to domestic abuse survivors in Illinois. My mother-in-law did not end up in poverty. She had her own assets, separate from the trust, and a home and a social circle and a life. But the trust, the thing she had managed and wielded and used to control her son and everyone around him for decades, was gone. Legally, permanently, gone. She did not speak to my husband for 8 months after the ruling. I heard from my sister-in-law, my husband's younger sister, who had always been kind to me in the careful, apologetic way of someone who sees what's happening but doesn't have the power to stop it, that when my mother-in-law finally called my husband again, the first thing she said was, "You should have married someone simple." He told me that himself, at one of our custody handoffs, standing in the parking lot of a park while our daughter toddled toward the swings. He said it was something that might have been pride or might have been regret or might have been both at the same time. "She wasn't wrong," I said. He laughed, which surprised us both. "My daughter's name is Rosie. She is 18 months old, and she has my mother's nose and my husband's dark eyes, and she has absolutely no idea what happened in the months before she was old enough to form memories. She will someday. I'll tell her the version that's true without being cruel, because I think she deserves to know where she comes from, and also to know that the people who loved her fought for her." She calls my sister Auntie Bay. She calls Frances, still living in the guest room, at this point by mutual preference, Nana Fran. She calls me Mama. She calls her father Dada, and when he shows up on Saturdays she runs toward him with her arms out, and I watch that, and I feel something that took me a long time to identify. It's not bitterness. It's not grief anymore. Or not mostly. It's something like watching a building you used to live in from across the street. You can see its shape clearly now, all the things you couldn't see when you were inside it. I tell this story because I think people imagine that when something like this happens, there's a version where you are destroyed by it. And there is. That version exists and it's real and it could have been mine. But the other thing I know from my work and from my own life is that the people who come at you with documents and money and ultimatums are counting on you not knowing what you have. They're counting on you being too tired, too shocked, too overwhelmed to read the fine print. Read the fine print. Know what you have. My mother-in-law came to my hospital room with $18 million and a plan she'd been building for months. And she sat in the chair beside my bed, and she looked at me with that contractor's gaze and she thought she knew exactly what I was. She had no idea. I've thought a lot about what my mother-in-law actually believed when she walked into that hospital room. I don't think she was stupid. I think she was someone who had won so many times in so many rooms using the same playbook that she'd stopped imagining the other person had won too. That's the thing about power, that's only ever been used one way. It stops being power and starts being assumption. She assumed I was tired. She was right. She assumed I was scared. She was right about that too. What she didn't account for was that tired and scared and capable are not mutually exclusive. I had given birth less than 36 hours earlier and I had 14 stitches and an IV in my arm, and I was also, quietly, one of the better employment attorneys in Chicago. Those two things existed at the same time. She only saw one of them. My husband stood at that window for 6 hours and never turned around. I used to think that was the most painful part of the whole story. That silence, that turned back. But I've come to understand it differently now. He wasn't being cruel. He was being a person who had never once had to decide who he was when it cost him something. His mother had always made the hard calls. He'd just been present for them. That's not an excuse. It's just what happened to a person who was never asked to be more than decorative. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that the choices that define you are almost always the ones you make when you're already at your lowest. Not when you're rested and prepared and surrounded by people who love you. When you're in the hospital bed. When the money is on the table. When the person who was supposed to be in your corner is facing the window. That's when you find out what you actually believe about yourself. I believed I was worth fighting for. I believed my daughter was worth fighting for. Not in a loud, declarative way. I wasn't making speeches in that room. It was quieter than that. It was just, no, not this, not here, not her. And then I picked up the phone and I started doing the work. I think about Rosie running toward her father on Saturday mornings, and I think about the trust fund that no longer exists, and the foundation that does. And I think the thing that connects those two facts is this: when you act from something real, not ego, not revenge, but genuine refusal to let something wrong stand unchallenged, the consequences tend to be proportionate, not magical, not instant. Proportionate. The structure my mother-in-law spent decades building was built on the assumption that everyone around her could be managed. The moment that assumption was wrong, the structure didn't hold. That's not fate. That's just architecture. I'm not a perfect person. I made mistakes in that marriage long before that hospital room. I stayed too long in situations I understood better than I admitted to myself. I confused comfort with security and called it love at least once or twice. But I read the fine print. And when the moment came, I knew what it said. That's the thing I'd tell anyone sitting in a version of that room, whatever their version looks like. You don't have to be fearless. You don't have to be ready. You just have to know what you have and refuse to pretend you don't. That's enough. It really is.